My mom and sister called the cops on my 5-year-old daughter. Let that sink in. I came home a day early from a work trip expecting to surprise her with donuts in the morning. Instead, I opened my front door and found her sobbing in front of 2 officers, her tiny hands shaking, her whole body curled in on itself like she was bracing for punishment. She thought those men were there to take her away. And for a moment, when she looked up at me with those swollen eyes, I realized she wasn't afraid of strangers, she was afraid of being abandoned. I didn't scream, even though every instinct in me wanted to tear the house apart. I acted. Quietly. Carefully. And a week later, they were the ones screaming. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you're from. I love seeing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection can remind someone they're not alone. Thank you. And now, here's my story. My name is Thatcher Wild, and what I'm about to tell you is the week my entire family tried to break me and how protecting my daughter changed everything. If my story resonates with you, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you think, especially for a single father trying to make sense of all this. I came home early. The key turned slower than usual, my fingers still dusted with crumbs from the gas station muffin I'd eaten on the drive back from Denver. I pushed the door open on a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and something in the air told me immediately that something was wrong. It was quiet, too quiet, and that quiet had weight, the kind that slides under your skin before your brain can name it. Then I saw them. 2 officers stood in my living room. One was taking notes, pen scratching steadily across a small pad. The other was crouched down near my daughter, my 5-year-old Poppy, who sat curled into the edge of the couch, her arms pinned tight to her sides, her eyes glued to the floor. She wasn't crying out loud. She was doing that quiet, shaking kind of crying that comes from fear, not from pain. The kind I knew instantly. Across from her, my mother Sylvie stood with her arms crossed like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. My sister Briar held her daughter Ivy as if the toddler were a fragile exhibit she'd brought as evidence. The scene felt staged, everyone in their position ready for my entrance. I stepped forward, slow, deliberate. I didn't scream. I didn't even raise my voice. I knelt beside Poppy, bringing myself to her level. And when she looked up at me, I saw terror in her eyes, the kind of terror no child should ever feel in their own home. I wrapped my arms around her, felt her small body collapse into mine, her breath hitching against my collar. The officer stood a little straighter when he saw me. "Sir, we were responding to a call about an altercation between children," he said. "We were told you were out of town. We've spoken with the adults present." I looked directly at my mother. "You called the police on a 5-year-old child." Sylvie didn't flinch. "She needs to understand consequences," she said with that clipped calm she's mastered her whole life. Briar chimed in, shifting Ivy dramatically on her hip. "She's out of control, Thatcher." She pushed Ivy. "She needs to learn." The officer glanced at them, then back at me. "This really isn't something that warrants dialing 911, he said, polite but firm. "Calling for something like this can be considered misuse of emergency services." Misuse. A word my mother would never apply to herself, but it sat perfectly on what she'd just done. I tightened my hold on Poppy and murmured into her hair, "You're okay. I'm here. No one's taking you anywhere, sweetheart." Her grip around my neck tightened, desperate and relieved all at once. When the officers finally left, I stood between Sylvie and Briar and my daughter. "Neither of you," I said, my voice low but steady, "will ever be alone with her again." Sylvie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk, but something practiced, calculated. Something that told me this wasn't a moment of bad judgment. Something had been planned. I told myself it was just overreaction. Just a mistake. But as I held Poppy's trembling shoulders against me, I felt the unmistakable truth pressing in. This wasn't the first crack. It was just the first one I could no longer ignore. And as that thought lodged itself in my chest, another followed. I thought this was a misunderstanding until I began to remember. Memory has a way of sharpening when you least want it to. Standing in my kitchen later that night after Poppy finally fell asleep with her cheek pressed against my ribs, the past opened up in front of me with a clarity I hadn't asked for. I grew up in a house where everything looked perfect. My mother's vanity was always spotless, every bottle lined in angles so precise they felt like threats. Our living room smelled like lemon polish, not warmth. My mother Sylvie trained us, me and Briar, to move like we were on display. Don't make noise, she'd say. And don't embarrass the family. Always keep your dignity. That was her gospel. Not affection, not comfort. Dignity. My father Ellis was the only softness in the house. He'd fix things without being asked: the loose hinge, the broken lamp, the tears we tried to hide. He'd hand me hot chocolate when I cried in my room, even if he never said the words I needed. What happened? Tell me. You're safe. He was a life raft, never a shield. I left at 18 because I knew if I didn't, I'd never get to breathe. Boulder was my escape. A shoebox apartment near Pearl Street, a job shelving books at a used bookstore, long nights studying UX design. I learned to take care of myself the way some kids learn to ride a bike because no one else was going to do it for me. And even then, some part of me carried that old ache, the one that whispered, maybe one day your family will be different. When my father died suddenly without warning, Sylvie reappeared in my life with a casserole and a strangely gentle tone. She asked about my work. She asked about Poppy. She acted like she cared. And because grief makes you believe in soft things, I let her back in. I let her be a grandmother. I wanted Poppy to have the family I never did. Sylvie began bringing small gifts, frozen meals, store-bought muffins. She'd offer to watch Poppy for just an hour when I needed to work. Briar came around too, showing up with Ivy stepping into my doorway with the same helpless tilt of her head Dad used to have, but without the warmth behind it. And slowly, without noticing, I slid into a role I'd played my whole childhood, the one who fixes everything. I paid off part of Briar's car loan so it wouldn't be repossessed. I covered some of my mother's medical bills. I paid a plumber to fix her water heater, then footed the utility bill when she forgot. 100 here, 300 there. A pattern forming so gradually that it disguised itself as duty. And the more I did, the more they expected. The more they leaned. The more they acted like it was my job. But there were moments, small ones, that in hindsight feel like warning signs. The day Sylvie took a picture of Poppy without asking and immediately texted it to Briar saying, "Proof she listens to me better than him." The comment at a family gathering when she said, half joking but not really, "Now that Ellis is gone, someone has to hold Thatcher accountable." The remark to a cousin that resurfaced in my mind as I stood in my kitchen. There are ways to make sure he doesn't walk away again. Back then it sounded like a bitter joke. Now it sounded like strategy. And as I replayed everything, the frozen smiles, the staged kindness, the way Poppy had shrunk in on herself the moment she saw those officers, something inside me shifted. What if the police call wasn't a lapse in judgment? What if it was exactly what they wanted? What if they'd been laying groundwork for months and I'd been too focused on giving Poppy a family to see the trap forming around us? I thought of the trembling in Poppy's hands. I thought of Sylvie's almost smile as I told her she'd never be alone with my daughter again. And the question formed heavy and cold. If this was a setup, how long have I been standing in the middle of it without realizing? In the weeks leading up to the day the officers stood in my living room, things had already been unraveling, just slowly enough that I didn't recognize the pattern. It started with Ivy tugging on my sleeve one afternoon, her voice small and oddly rehearsed as she said, "Poppy slapped me." I had seen the entire moment she was referring to. They'd both reached for the same doll, their fingers collided, and Ivy had let out a cry so sudden it startled even herself. But by the time Briar repeated the story to me, it had grown arms and legs. She pushed her hard, she said on the phone, sounding wounded, disappointed, like she expected me to apologize on behalf of my child. Then Sylvie posted a photo of the girls playing in her backyard. In the picture, Poppy was mid-laugh, hair flying behind her, completely unaware she was being used as a prop. The caption read, "A little too competitive for her age. But we're working on it." Working on what? Being 5. Wanting a toy. I stared at the caption longer than I wanted to admit, feeling something in my chest tighten. But I told myself I was imagining it, that I was tired. That family had rough edges sometimes. But the timing of everything, every comment, every sigh, every concern always lined up with the moments I was away for work, or when Poppy was left in their care for a few hours. I didn't see the choreography then. I only felt the drain. And yet, looking back, the signs were everywhere. Ivy crying the same way each time a camera pointed in her direction, tears appearing perfectly on cue. Sylvie hovering whenever I pulled out my wallet, her posture straightening as if she were resetting the dynamic she believed she owned. Briar's late afternoon texts, always vague, always implying that something was wrong with Poppy, something I needed to fix. What I couldn't see then was how coordinated it all was. I remember one day picking Poppy up after work. She told me her grandmother had said the police come when kids don't listen. She said it like it was a fact she'd memorized, like her multiplication tables. My daughter had always been a bright, open kid, soft, where I'd been hardened young, but hearing that sentence in her little voice made me feel physically sick. Still, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was overreacting. Sometimes adults said stupid things without thinking. Sometimes families miscommunicated. I wanted to believe that so badly it blinded me. But everything sharpened the day I tried to understand why Sylvie had called the police at all. I went into her email hoping to find a message she might have sent the officers or some explanation for why she would take something so small and turn it into a crisis. Instead, I found something else, something that froze me where I stood, a message thread between Sylvie and Briar. The subject line was plain: before he gets home. Inside were screenshots, instructions, and voice memos. One from Briar saying, "Remind Ivy to cry for real, not the fake one. Tell her to say she was pushed hard." Another, "Make sure she mentions she's scared. It has to sound convincing." And then a short audio clip. Briar's voice low and coaxing, telling Ivy exactly what words to say. I clicked play and hearing my sister whisper, "Say Daddy scares you. Say you don't feel safe," made something hot and electric surge through my body. There was even a short video file, grainy, clearly filmed with a phone, showing Ivy being positioned, then crying on demand after Briar nodded. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. I had suspected manipulation, but this was fabrication. A staged narrative. A manufactured crisis built on the back of a child who didn't understand any of it. I sat down hard, the chair creaking beneath me. Anger flooded through me, but beneath that anger was something else: clarity. Everything I'd ignored, every uneasy moment, every comment that had scraped at the edges of my patience, it all assembled into a picture I couldn't unsee anymore. I didn't confront them. Not yet. If I reacted too fast, they'd deny it, twist it, turn it back on me like they always had. I needed more. I needed to be deliberate. For once, I needed to play the long game they'd forced me into. So I backed up every file. I dated my notes. I stored everything in a private folder. I shut the laptop slowly, my heart still pounding unevenly, and whispered to myself, "Now I finally know what I'm dealing with." And as I turned off the lights and checked on Poppy curled up sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, I understood something with bleak certainty. Now I had evidence. Now I had leverage. But how I used it would determine everything that came next. That night, after pacing the kitchen until the tile felt warm under my feet, I made a decision I should have made years ago. If I kept feeding the system they'd built financial support hidden under the disguise of family responsibility, they'd never stop. I could either shield Poppy, or I could continue subsidizing the very people who endangered her. I couldn't do both. So I sat down at my desk, opened my banking app, and pulled up every automatic payment linked to their lives. Briar's car payment. The monthly split utility bill Sylvie insisted she needed help with. The insurance premium I covered just until she got back on her feet. The occasional surprise charges, plumbers, roofers, medical copays. The extra fees for Ivy's preschool that Briar slipped into conversation as if they were my obligation. As I hovered over each toggle, switching off autopay one by one, I felt a strange mix of freedom and dread. Like cutting a rope that had been wrapped around my chest for years, only to discover I'd forgotten how to stand without its pressure. Less than an hour later, Briar texted, "Hey, the car payment didn't go through. Something wrong on your end." The casual tone was familiar, a practiced innocence. No, I typed back. I stopped paying. The reply came fast. What are you serious? I have Ivy to take care of. You can't just stop. I can, I wrote. And I am. I'm drawing a line. I'm protecting my daughter. The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. When her next message came, the sweetness was gone. You're unbelievable. How can you put us in this position, us, as if we were one organism feeding off the same lifeline? Not long after Sylvie called. Her voice was calm enough to fool a stranger. Family doesn't abandon each other, she said. Family doesn't stage scenes to terrify children, I answered. You're overreacting, she replied sharply. You always have. Poppy is getting out of control and you're too sensitive to see it. She needs structure. I swallowed the anger rising in my throat. Poppy isn't yours to fix. And she doesn't need your structure. There was a pause, tight calculating. I hope you realize what you're setting in motion, she said. Before I could reply, she ended the call. Later that afternoon, Breyer sent several long messages. Buried in the last one was a sentence that made my pulse stutter. You don't understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. A plan. I saved the message with the rest. That night after I tucked Poppy into bed, she asked quietly, "Why didn't Grandma call me today?" The confusion in her voice cut deep. I told her gently that Grandma was busy, that nothing was her fault, that grown-ups sometimes forget how to be kind. She accepted it, but her eyes lingered on mine as if she sensed more beneath the surface. When she fell asleep, I stayed beside her, brushing curls away from her face. The decision I'd made was already affecting her. I knew the days ahead would get worse before they got better. I also knew I didn't have a choice anymore. Later, as I wiped down the counter, my phone buzzed. An email from Poppy's preschool. We'd like to schedule a meeting regarding recent family developments. I stared at the subject line until the letters blurred. So this was it. Cutting off the money wasn't the end of the conflict, it was the beginning. By the time Monday rolled around, I could already feel the shift. I walked Poppy into her preschool like I always did, her small hand tucked inside mine, her backpack bouncing with each step. But the hallway that usually buzzed with easy chatter felt different. Parents who normally waved or made small talk suddenly stiffened when they saw me. A couple of them stepped aside, pretending to look at their phones. Others whispered just quiet enough to make their judgment obvious, but not so quiet that I couldn't tell the whispers were about us. One mother, someone I'd spoken to a dozen times about snack schedules and weekend hikes, gave me a brittle smile. "Everything okay with you two?" she asked, her eyes flicking to Poppy with a kind of wary pity. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, Miss Harper, one of Poppy's teachers, appeared in the doorway and said, "Thatcher, could I speak with you for a moment?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were uneasy. Inside the small conference room, she handed me a printed email. The subject line was a punch to the gut. Concerns regarding Poppy Wilde. I scanned the page. Whoever wrote it claimed Poppy had aggressive tendencies, that she was a danger to other children, and that the police had already been involved in a prior incident. Attached was a blurry screenshot of the police report from that awful day, a selective crop that made it look like my daughter had been the reason officers were called, not the victim of an adult's manufactured drama. My stomach turned. "Where did this come from?" I asked. "We checked the sending IP," she said quietly. "It's local. Boulder. Someone here. Someone close." The room felt smaller. My mother or Breyer alone could have done it, but the phrasing, the timing, the escalation suggested more than just the two of them. They had help, or at least encouragement. And the email had been sent to the school before anyone told me. I explained everything as evenly as I could, what happened in my living room, how the story had been twisted, how my family had orchestrated this. But I didn't reveal the evidence I had gathered. Not yet. I needed it, intact, unchallenged, ready for the moment it mattered most. Miss Harper listened closely, and I could see she believed me on a human level, but professionally her hands were tied. Until we know more, she said, we just have to monitor things. That night, Poppy climbed into my lap with her favorite stuffed fox and asked, "Why don't my friends want to play with me anymore?" Her voice was small, fragile, in a way that made something inside me fracture. I held her close, and told her the only truth I could. Sometimes people hear things that aren't true, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups get confused. But you didn't do anything wrong. After she fell asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room feeling the weight of a fight that had expanded far beyond family drama. My mother had reached into my child's world and poisoned it. And as if the day hadn't already taken enough, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I never expected to see again. I heard Poppy is having behavioral issues. We need to talk. Wade, her biological father. A man who drifted in and out of responsibility the way wind changes direction. If the rumors had reached him, it meant they weren't just smearing me socially, they were preparing a legal shadow over us. I set the phone down and pressed my palms against the counter, forcing myself to breathe. I had evidence, hard proof. But one wrong move could drag Poppy into something far uglier than whispers in a preschool hallway. And for the first time since everything began, I felt fully, undeniably surrounded. Wade called the next morning, his voice soft but edged with something that made my teeth clench. "I'm worried," he said. "I think she needs a more stable environment. Maybe it's time I step in." Step in. As if he'd ever stepped anywhere except out. "You've been talking to someone," I said. "Who's feeding you this?" He hesitated. Just long enough to confirm the answer. "I got an email," he admitted. "Same kind the school got. And if it's true, it's not." I cut in. "And you know nothing about what she needs. You barely know her." He didn't argue that part, which told me more than anything else. He simply said, "If this ends up in court, they're going to ask why I didn't do anything." The moment the call ended, my chest felt tight. My mother had taken her campaign beyond community gossip. She had turned Wade into a weapon, and because of his absence, because of his guilt, he was gullible enough to wield it. Before I could even process that, Sylvie video called me. Her face filled the screen perfectly, composed, eyes sharp. "Everyone knows what's happening with you," she said. "You can't hide. You're hurting Poppy, and people are talking." Behind her, I heard Briar say, "Play it." A second later, an audio clip came through, small, trembling Ivy saying, "Poppy hit me." But I recognized the cadence, the coaching. I could practically hear Briar's whisper behind those words. "You're creating a record of instability," Sylvie continued. "If you keep being difficult, the court will have to intervene, you know that." My grip tightened around the phone. "If anyone's unstable," I said, "it's the people weaponizing children." I hung up before she could respond, but the damage wasn't confined to family lines. That afternoon, one of the teachers pulled me aside privately. "Someone called asking if we'd filed any incident reports about Poppy," she said. "They wanted us to keep a closer eye on her. They wouldn't give a name." My throat felt dry. They were building a paper trail that didn't exist, hoping that eventually something would stick. Then came the moment that confirmed the worst of my fears. I stopped by Sylvie's house to pick up a box of old documents she claimed belonged to me. While she wasn't home, the computer in her office hummed softly, screen glowing. I shouldn't have looked, but something pulled me toward it, a gut instinct sharpened by weeks of deceit. There on the desktop was a folder titled Case Record. Inside were dozens of clips: Poppy crying after falling in the yard, Poppy flinching when a dog barked, Poppy frozen mid-tantrum after being scolded by Sylvie. Each video was trimmed to remove context, leaving only the most damning frames. There were even pictures, screenshots of text threads, captions rewritten to imply behavioral problems that didn't exist. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. They had been documenting her for months, waiting, collecting, curating a narrative they could present to anyone who might listen. This had never been about teaching Poppy lessons. This was preparation. Something cold settled into my spine. I knew exactly what this collection was meant for, and if I didn't act fast, they would use it to pry Poppy away from me. I went home with the box, sat on the living room floor, and started assembling everything I had: emails, screenshots, recordings, the manufactured messages, and now these videos. I labeled each file, carefully organized everything into a dated timeline. Every piece strengthened the case that they weren't just meddling, they were actively trying to destabilize my custody. By the time I checked the clock, it was past 3 in the morning. Poppy was asleep in her room, breathing softly, unaware of the war waged in her name. I opened the Boulder County Court website, stared at the form for a protective order, and felt my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. If I didn't cut them off now, they would destroy her. And so, with the house silent around me and the weight of every memory pressing on my shoulders, I began typing. The morning after I filed the online petition, I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, the cursor blinking like it was daring me to back out. Instead, I dragged every piece of evidence into the upload window one by one. The anonymous emails sent to the parents, the nearly identical one sent to Wade, the text exchange between Sylvie and Briar plotting how to coach Ivy, the voice memo of Briar whispering instructions, the folder of edited clips meant to paint Poppy as unstable. As each file loaded, my hands trembled, but my resolve only hardened. When I finally clicked submit and saw the confirmation message, "Your request is under review," I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for years. The next afternoon, I received an email from the court. A temporary protective order had been granted. Effective immediately, Sylvie and Briar were barred from contacting me or Poppy, from approaching our home, from coming within 200 feet of Poppy's school, and from attempting to relay messages through anyone else. For the first time in weeks, I felt a pocket of air open around me, a brief but genuine breath. That breath didn't last long. Only hours later, Sylvie posted a long, dramatic message online, thinly veiled but unmistakably about me. She wrote about a son suffering emotional instability, about a child lost in chaos, about dangerous neglect that forced her to act. She tagged several local community groups, ensuring the post would surface in feeds of parents around Boulder. She claimed she was praying for the little one's safety, a line so insidious it made my stomach twist. She wasn't contacting me directly, but she was weaponizing her audience. It was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the order while keeping her hands clean. Then a parent from Poppy's school forwarded me a message Briar had sent privately, a warning to keep your kids away from Poppy until this blows over. The parent wrote, "I thought you should know. I'm sorry this is happening." The message became another piece of evidence, but it also confirmed something else: they weren't slowing down. They were escalating. 2 days later, the situation shattered into something even more dangerous. When I arrived at school to pick up Poppy, Miss Harper met me at the door with a tight expression. "We need to talk," she said. "There are 2 women outside who claim to be Poppy's grandmother and aunt." My chest went cold. "They're not allowed here, we know," she said. "We've locked the side gate and asked them to leave, but they're refusing." Through the glass front door, I saw Sylvie and Briar standing at the fence. Sylvie was pacing, her posture rigid with fury, while Briar clutched a packet of papers and was waving them in the air. I stepped outside, keeping enough distance to respect the court order, even though they had already broken it. "You can't keep us away," Briar yelled, lifting the papers. "We have a new report about Poppy. You can't hide the truth." It didn't matter what was in her hands: a forged document, a fake report, another attempt to provoke a reaction. All that mattered was that parents waiting for pickup were already staring, whispering, watching, as if this were entertainment. Inside the building, I could see little faces pressed to the window, and one of them was Poppy's. She looked terrified. "Leave this property now," I said, my voice steady. "You're violating a court order." "You did this," Sylvie shouted. "You poisoned Poppy against her family. You're the reason she's suffering." Before I could respond, 2 police officers approached from the parking lot. The school had already called 911. The officers positioned themselves between us and addressed my mother and sister calmly but firmly. "You've been notified of the protective order. You need to leave immediately or face legal consequences." Sylvie argued, insisting she was being wronged, claiming she was only trying to save her granddaughter. Briar shook with frustration, insisting the papers she held were proof the court needed to see. But the officers didn't budge. After several tense minutes, they were escorted off the property, still shouting over their shoulders. I didn't say a word. I just walked inside, found Poppy trembling near the coat hooks, and scooped her into my arms. Her face buried in my neck, her small body shaking. "It's okay," I whispered. "They can't get to you. Not anymore." As I carried her out, I looked back at the school entrance, at the lingering shadows of what had just happened, and felt the last thread of fear snap. They could scream all they wanted. This time, I wasn't the one afraid. The hearing took place 2 weeks later in a modest courtroom lined with pale wood and stiff chairs. I sat beside my attorney, though I'd compiled most of the evidence myself. On the opposite side of the room sat Sylvie and Briar with their lawyer, someone who looked increasingly uncomfortable each time he reviewed their documents. Poppy was not required to be present, thank God, and waited with a child advocate in another room. When the judge entered and the hearing began, the weight of everything that had happened since the day I came home early felt like it was pressing on my chest. But I stayed calm as I laid out the truth. The judge asked for evidence, and one by one I provided it: the emails, the screenshots, the message threads showing clear coordination, the original videos compared against the edited versions. The judge's eyebrows lifted more than once, especially when he saw the folder titled Case Record. Then came the questioning. Mrs. Wynne, the judge said to Sylvie, "Did you or your daughter instruct a minor child to rehearse statements describing harm that did not occur?" Sylvie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I did what I believed was necessary. My grandson is overwhelmed and his child needs discipline." "That is not an answer," the judge said. Before she could formulate a better one, Briar shifted, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. And then Ivy, who had been allowed into the room at her mother's request, spoke up in the clear, innocent way children often do. "Grandma told me to cry loud," she said, "so the police would come. Mama said to say Poppy pushed me." The room fell silent. The lawyer at their table froze. Sylvie's face drained of color, and Briar's shoulders buckled as though the air had been sucked out of her lungs. She reached for Ivy, but it was too late. The truth was already hanging in the space between us, undeniable and unrepairable. By the end of the hearing, the temporary order was extended into a long-term protective order. For 6 months, potentially a year, Sylvie and Briar were prohibited from contacting Poppy in any form, coming near her school, or attempting to involve me or my daughter in further legal maneuvering. The judge added a formal note that their actions had caused direct emotional harm to a minor and posed a risk of continued manipulation. As the courtroom emptied, I learned the final piece of the puzzle. Investigators had discovered that Sylvie had been speaking with a family law advisor months earlier. She had been told incorrectly that if she could present enough documentation showing I was unfit or overwhelmed, she could petition for temporary guardianship of Poppy. Suddenly, the months of staged videos, the edited clips, the carefully engineered moments of fear and catastrophe made sense. She had been building a narrative, one she believed would give her legal control over my child. The realization hit hard. None of this had ever been about love. It was about possession. Briar, already drowning financially after losing my support, burst into tears outside the courtroom. Ivy clung to her leg, confused and frightened. For a moment I felt the familiar flicker of sympathy, but it faded quickly. I had carried their weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. In the weeks that followed, I focused on healing the only person who mattered, Poppy. I took her to a child therapist who understood trauma in the smallest bodies. Slowly, she stopped jumping whenever she saw a police car. Slowly, she let go of the fear that she was bad. Slowly, she believed me when I told her she was safe. We moved a month later into a quieter neighborhood near a park. Poppy chose a room with a wide window and sunlight that pooled on the floor every morning. She covered her walls with rainbows, and her favorite green dragon, the one she said guarded her dreams. Life didn't snap back into place. It rebuilt itself piece by piece, quietly and sturdily. Some nights after she falls asleep, I stand in her doorway and watch her breathing, soft and steady, the kind of peace she should have always known. And in those moments, I let myself acknowledge the truth. Family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who let you breathe. I still carry regret for not drawing boundaries sooner. But I also know I stepped in when it mattered. I acted before the damage became permanent. And as I turn off the light and close her door, I hear the echo of the first line I spoke when this all began, reshaped now into something final. A week after they called the cops on my daughter, they were the ones screaming. And for the first time in a long time, I finally had silence. And if you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you. Telling this story still shakes something loose inside me, but it also reminds me how far we've come. If any part of this felt familiar, or if you've ever had to fight for your child's safety the way I did, I hope you know you're not alone. Before you go, say "still" here in the comments so I know you made it to the end. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe. Your presence means more than you know.